Welcome to week 7-ish of Substance. Good to see you here. I hope you're reading along. If I could have only done the book on one of the chapters of the book, it would have either been chapter 1 or it would have been this chapter, because I think they say the exact same thing. I'm just trying to hide that from you. In a well-known and regarded investigative journal called The Onion, the following story was recorded. Camden, Massachusetts. Longtime acquaintances confirmed to reporters this week that local man Michael Husmer, an unambitious 29-year-old loser who leads an enjoyable and fulfilling life, still lives in his hometown and has no desire to leave. Claiming that the aimless slouch has never resided more than 2 hours from his parents and still hangs out with friends from high school, sources close to Husmer reported that the man, who has meaningful, lasting personal relationships and a healthy work-life balance, is an unmotivated washout who's perfectly comfortable with being a nobody for the rest of his life. I've known Mike my whole life, and he's a good guy, but it's pretty pathetic that he's still living on the same street he grew up on and experiencing a deep sense of personal satisfaction about it, childhood friend David Gorman said of the unaspiring, completely gratified do-nothing. As soon as Mike graduated from college, he moved back home and started working at a local insurance firm. Now he's nearly 30 years old, living in the exact same town he was born in, working at the same small-time job, and is extremely contented in all aspects of his home and professional lives. It's really sad. Additionally, pointing to the intimate, enduring connections he's developed with his wife, parents, siblings, and neighbors, sources reported that Husmer's life is, quote, pretty humiliating, end quote, on multiple levels. Husmer's ordinary life is debt-free. He's perfectly content to stay put. While many of his high school friends go off to the bright lights in big city, he doesn't care about impressing total strangers every day as he climbs the corporate ladder, and he can invest in the lives of those closest to him. He doesn't have 1,000 friends on Facebook, just a close family and circle of friends in town. Quote, I'm just glad I got out of there and didn't end up like Mike, said Husmer's cousin, Amari Martin, 33, an attorney at a large law firm who hasn't seen Husmer, his closest childhood playmate, for nearly 6 years. The last thing I'd ever want is to have a loving family nearby, feeling a sense of pleasure when reflecting on my life, and being the big failure that everyone runs into when they visit home once a year for the holidays. On a more serious note, Michael Horton, in his book Ordinary, has a testimony from this woman named Tish, who grew up in a large evangelical church in Texas, and then was like, is all there is reaching respectable Texas Republicans to following Jesus, and she wanted to do something radical. So she went and served orphans in Africa, and then she came home to go to college, and this is what she writes about that. I was nearly 22 years old and had just returned to my college town from a part of Africa that had apparently missed the last 3 centuries. As I walked to church in my weathered, worn-in chacos, I bumped into the new associate pastor and introduced myself. He smiled warmly and said, "Oh, you. I've heard about you. You're the radical who wants to give your life away for Jesus." It was meant as a compliment, and I took it as one, but it also felt like a lot of pressure because in a new way, I was torturously uncertain about what being a radical and living for Jesus was supposed to mean for me. Here I was back in America, needing a job and health insurance, toying with dating a law student intellectual who wasn't really all that radical, and unsure about how to be faithful to Jesus in an ordinary life. I'm not sure if I even knew if it was possible. I entered college restless and with questions, and spent my 20s reading radicals and even inviting my whole evangelical fellowship to protests. After spending time in various radical Christian communities, I began to wonder if an ordinary life was even possible. Now, I'm a 30-something with 2 kids living a more or less ordinary life. And what I'm slowly realizing is that for me, being in a house all day with a baby and a 2-year-old is a lot more scary and a lot harder than being in a war-torn African village. What I need courage for is the ordinary, the daily everydayness of life. Caring for a homeless kid is a lot more thrilling to me than listening well to the people in my home. Giving away clothes and seeking out edgy Christian communities requires less of me than being kind to my husband on an average Wednesday morning, or calling my mother back when I don't feel like it. Roger observes about this. Every day is my problem. It's easy to think what you would do in wartime, or if a hurricane blows through, or if you spent a month in Paris, or if your guy wins the election, or if you won the lottery or bought that thing you wanted. It's a lot more difficult to figure out how you're going to get through today without despair. You know how that feels. Even more than being afraid of failure, we are all terrified by boredom. The difference between being able to embrace the ordinary as a God-made and redeemed creature and worshiping the god Mammon, wishing we were a god and wanting to do whatever we want to do to get whatever we want out of life, is the very fault line between godliness and idolatry, between worldliness and godliness, between Mammon and Jesus. It is literally the ground on which the battle is fought over what sort of creature you will be, what you will be of soul, whether or not you will really believe in Jesus, whether or not you will try to serve two masters, or whether you'll try to seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness so that everything else can be added to you by God. Because there's a certain logical flow to this where these things go together, right? So if you really are afraid of boredom and you really believe that you're just going to live this one time and just that's it, and you need to suck all the marrow out of life, then the fact that you only live once is going to lead you to an attitude of I want what I want, right? Because you have to be able to just get what you want. Because if you're not allowed to live by I want what I want, then that's not really being faithful to the fact that you only live once and you need to suck all the marrow out of life. But if you've got to be able to give yourself to you want what you want, then the problem is that there's lots of things out there, and all of them look positive, and you might really feel good about lots of different things, and you can't do them all, and so you're going to have a constant fear of missing out because you're going to want what you're going to want because you know that you only live once. And what that's generally going to lead to is the belief that you need to be fully committed to absolute freedom, that is to be unencumbered by anyone, so that you can give yourself to what's novel, what's exotic, what's new, what's right now, right? That's totally different from recognizing that as a creature, the moment you were born and crying like that child, you were born as I can't do anything for myself, complete schlub that was utterly incompetent of doing anything but making verbal sounds that mean nothing, almost. Right? If you came into this world and you're alive, somebody cared for you. And when somebody cared for you, you entered into a role, the role of child. And the minute you entered into that role, a moral set of relationships and entanglements ensued. You became the child of a parent. You became part of a family. You entered into a society. And these things have all these various and relative kinds of connections. And the minute you received any role in terms of who you are in that place, there were certain responsibilities that went along with that role. So God could say to children, for example, obey and respect your father and mother. That's your responsibility. That's responsibility that's part of the role of being a child. Parents have tons of responsibilities. Kids have about one, right? Which parents can use to make it 1,000. But we'll talk about that another time. Right? So if you have these roles, and they vary over the course of your life, all of those roles have attending responsibilities that entangle you to everybody else. Those responsibilities are not one-time things. Those responsibilities happen over and over and over again. The dishes need to be washed again. The clothes need to be cleaned again. And the reports have to be done at work again. The sermon has to be preached again. Everything has to be done again and again and again and again and again and again and again, right? The soldier has to go out and guard again. Everything has to happen over and over. And so all of these roles create these responsibilities, and those responsibilities are almost always repetitive, which means that the most fundamental thing about you being happy, after acknowledging that there's a creator, which we'll get to in a little bit, is that you become the kind of person who is fundamentally happy in rhythm with creation. That is, that C.S. Lewis says this in Screw Tape Letters, that God has put within the human heart the love of change and the love of stability. And both through sin are now out of whack, but both are present. And so human beings love change, and they love for things to stay the same. That's why when you went away from home the first time, off to college or wherever, you wanted to go and experience new things, and you wanted to come home, and you wanted home to be exactly the way you left it, including like your room. Right? And it's why there's this saying that you can never go home again, because when you go home, it never is really the way you left it, right? Because you want change, but you don't want change, and you want change, but you really want stability, because human beings want both things, and there's actually a way to get both change and stability. in which you can be completely fulfilled in both human desires and longings. And here's what it's called. It's called rhythm. Right? God help me. Okay, listen. Pray for me. But I guarantee you, the first snowfall of this winter, I will enjoy. Probably like the first 15. It'll get cold one day and I'll like it. I'll be like, oh, it's crisp out. Because I have been hot this summer. And by the time spring comes around and things begin to get green, I'll be so grateful because they were just gray. And all of these things will get renewed. Right? My wife leaves and I want her to be back. She comes back and we spend a lot of time together and I'm willing to let her go do some stuff. And she feels similarly about me. Right? There's this sort of like, even like eating, like nobody wants to eat like right after they ate. If somebody rubs your arm, that's nice, but not if they do it for 2 hours. Right? There's like, even in visceral pleasures, there's this like recharging that happens, right? And so God has made us the kind of creatures that if we're whole and substantive and mature, that we live in a love for change and a love for stability, rotating in the rhythms of perfect orbit within the repetitions built into our responsibilities that are part of our roles. And that's what's most fundamental about us, not the other. So if I was to like steal the genre of the early chapters of Proverbs, where Lady Folly makes her play, and then Lady Wisdom makes her play, this is maybe how I would do it for worldliness and ordinary, and embracing ordinary. Lady Worldliness would say something like this: living typical, uninteresting, repetitive, stuck, traditional lives without risk or passion is boring, miserable, and a waste. It'll leave you resentful, weary, and angry. It's better to live an extraordinary life. Don't settle down. See the world. Don't settle for some ordinary lover. Find your soulmate. Don't settle on a job you don't love. Find work that's almost play, that changes the world. Don't get stuck doing the same thing every day. See what's new in the world. To be happy means to be ready to change things, to risk, to be bold. I think a Lady Wisdom, understanding the ordinary, would say something like this: mammon is all promise and no substance. Embracing normal isn't selling out, it's embracing the wholesomeness of identity as a creature in a world of rhythm and repetitions. Travel some, but do it mainly to open your eyes to the infinite discoveries within your home. Work is toil, but it can be a productive and good one. There are no soulmates, but you can pour out your heart and soul for your ordinary mate. You don't need to see what's new in the world nearly as much as what's divinely lovely in it. What's good is good everywhere, and it isn't new. Our happiness is found in our bonds, what duties we accept and perform, and in what risks and boldness we trust in the wholesomeness of how God has created us in this creation. You see, the claim of the book of Ecclesiastes, and really the whole Bible, is that everything that worldliness would make you fear is exactly what it delivers. That's what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. And ultimately, one of the great insights, so I've told people before that if I was going to speak in universities the rest of my life out of the Bible, and I could only have one biblical text to do it, there's no question I would choose the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of the most sophisticated books in the Bible, and it is the happiness manual of the Bible. A lot of people think that it's a terribly depressing book because Solomon kind of loses his faith in the narrative text of the Bible as his story is told in some other books. Solomon's like really with God early on, and then he just like falls away, marries all these foreign women, worships the foreign gods, kind of loses his way, and then nothing is said about him coming back. And so people then read Ecclesiastes and they say, well, Solomon like lost his faith, and then he wrote this. So basically what Ecclesiastes is a book about how to not be. And what not to think. And it's not. It's actually the book of a man who comes back to faith late in his life and who realizes he's full of a court of nobles, and the important people of Israel are the people that he deserves after living the way he did. They're sophisticated, they're wealthy, they're worldly, they're not godly, they worship all kinds of foreign gods, and they think that they're hot, sophisticated stuff. And he decides to teach them what he has regained late in his life. Does that make sense? And what he tries to teach in this book is that God uses the ordinary of life to both frustrate worldliness and to forge substance or godliness. God uses the ordinary to frustrate worldliness and to forge godliness. The point of the way God has created the world in this work of rhythm is that if you give yourself to worldliness, it's designed to make you horrifically unhappy and mad. And that is a gift of God. Because otherwise you wouldn't listen to any other options. Like, we're the kind of creatures, we're so strong-headed, right, that unless something is really not working, usually we're not willing to change plans. But then the very same thing that was designed to make us so angry and frustrated about life, once we come to him and embrace the ordinary as we're meant to, it becomes the means by which he creates spiritual substance in us and gives us wisdom and happiness. That's the argument. So let's try to follow this. God used the ordinary to frustrate worldliness. So like in 2 years, I'm going to preach through the book of Ecclesiastes. If I could take a year off, I would write a book on it if I thought anybody would read it. I love this book and what it yields for us, but I need to do the short version again, okay? So what happens is the book starts with life is vapor, right? It's often translated meaninglessness, but the word is vapor in Hebrew. And what it means is that the things in this world are both insubstantial and momentary. They're insubstantial, meaning there's not enough ultimate meaning in them. You can't like root or ground like as much meaning in them as you really long to, right? And then secondly, they're momentary. They're there and then they're gone, and you want change, but you also want what's good to last, but then it doesn't, and it's really frustrating. And so he said, so I entered into this experiment where, allowing my wisdom to guide me, I tried everything. Right? Now, I want you to notice two things. One is, he tried wisdom before he tried debauchery. That's really important. I'm not going to talk much about that right now. And secondly, he says, all the while, even when I did folly, wisdom was there guiding me. The reason I think he says that is that in order for things that are not truly divinely beautiful to make us happy, the only way they can make us happy is if there is a false set of beliefs that go along with them. That is, we have to kind of think foolishly to enjoy foolishness. Does that make sense? And what he's saying is, even when I did the drink and the drugs and the women and all of that, I never bought into the fundamental structural lies that allowed me to fully give myself to that. I still wanted to keep my eyes awake in the sense of wisdom so I could see what it really was. He said, I tried to do that for everything. And then he said, so the question was, is there anything worthwhile under the sun? And he said, this is what I tested. And if you go through Ecclesiastes, these are things he tests. You will recognize some of these in what you have tried to test. First was wisdom, and by this he means a profound amount of education, right? Like 4 PhD kind of deal, right? Like he was apparently incredibly brilliant, right? And what he found was that the more, he said, with the increase of wisdom comes the increase of, anybody know? Grief, right? And the reason why the increase of knowledge creates the increase of grief, for those of you who may not know, is because there aren't answers to most of the most difficult and painful questions of life. Education doesn't get you the answers to the worst problems in humanity. The problems in humanity are not simple solutions. Like, if you think racism has like a reason it exists and a solution, that's very immature and foolish. Okay? Almost no persistent problem has like a reason it exists and therefore a solution. There's nothing. Nothing's like that. What life is more like is this really mixed up game of pickup sticks that are almost like wrapped around each other a little bit. And you're trying to figure out like which one you can move, and you know there's none of them you can move, and you just can't get what you want. And you wish that if you like just knew enough, you could like make it all work. And you find out you can't, and that's really depressing. Especially when you've invested all that time in thinking it was the answer. So then he turns to women and booze, which makes sense, right? He was studying in France. And then, just kidding. And he goes, so then he turns to achievement. He builds things nobody's ever built before, never even dreamed up. Some of the great wonders of the ancient world, his palace and the great temple, right? And then he actually talks about being original, like how he wanted to be different than everybody before him, somehow fundamentally distinct, right? And then he was wealthier than anybody before him. He had every experience that you could imagine and brought in all kinds of experience. He like shipped in stuff from all the different kingdoms of the world, all kinds of interesting things. And so he became so renowned in reputation that kings and queens of other nations, like the queen of Ethiopia, came to talk with him because he was so renowned in terms of his reputation. And he said, after I looked at all of this, and I tried to see what was worthwhile in it, right? What was not vapor? What was not insubstantial and momentary? He said the answer was nothing. not any of it. He said, but here was the result. Here was the result in me as a human being as I pursued these things as though they were ultimate in order to investigate whether they were ultimate. Here's how I ended up feeling. I was weary. I felt crushed. I felt like everything was full of this futility. I felt gloom, right? So much that I had to turn to drink to try to cheer me up. Huge dissatisfaction, anxious striving, deep depression, until ultimately I experienced the hatred of my own life, right? If you've been here for 6 weeks, does that remind you of anything? That list remind you of anything? That list of internal feelings, that's exactly what Jesus says worldliness produces. Seeking the world as though it is ultimate is worldliness. That's what Solomon did. He did this massive experience with worldliness. And what he found happened in his heart and mind as he experimented with it turns out to be exactly, except Solomon tells us more than Jesus tells us, exactly what Jesus told us would happen if we tried to have two gods, him and worldliness. Right? That we'd feel weary. And so he gets to the end and he says, he's talking about all his dissatisfaction. He says, this is Solomon talking against. He said, I hated life. And then he says, I hated everything that I had toiled for under the sun. And my heart began to despair. That's where he was. He said, that's where it'll lead you, right? And so he's doing this talk, right? He's giving this talk to his nobles. He's like, so here's the answer, right? And he's intentionally giving a very unsatisfying answer. He says, listen, if you want to know what really gets out of this cycle of self-hatred and hatred of life and all that leads to, it's just this. Here's the answer. A man or woman can do nothing better than to eat, drink, and find satisfaction in his work. This, too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless and a chasing after the wind. See what he's saying? He's saying, look, here's what you do. You want to be happy? Quit trying to think you can actually find the kind of anchor you want in all the things that are in the world. You can't. And it's kind of ironic because he's talking to these like educated, sophisticated people, and he's basically saying, you know the guy out who pushes the plow, who wakes up in the morning and eats his bread with thankfulness, and drinks his water with thankfulness, and talks to his wife, and then goes and pushes a plow through the same dirt he's pushed it through every year since he was born, that person finds God's enjoyment. The meaning and the lasting nature of what you're looking for actually is at the hand of the plowman, at the hand of the laborer, at the hand of the person who toils, who does it in humility and just knows that they're a creature and they're not God. Right? And before he gets to the real answer, he actually tips his hand as to what the answer is. Because as he's talking about giving himself to achievement, he says this, my heart took delight in all my work, and this was my reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Okay, do you see what he's saying? He's saying that when he did the work itself, he was happy. You see, when he got to the end of building like the temple, right, and he surveyed it almost like God, he like got up and was like, what's the meaning of this temple we've built? Right? He's gotten literally tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people, to give up years of their life to bring stone from everywhere in the world, to bring it into this place and to make this wonder of the ancient world. He says, when I surveyed it, I was really depressed. When I surveyed the achievement, he's like, but I realized later that when I was doing it, like when I was signing off on orders and when I was helping with the design and when I was doing the things, I was happy then. And I realized the happiness that I had when I did the work was the reward. See what he's saying? Think about it this way. Let's say I pastor for 45 years, okay? And let's say I try to build some like really great movement with Jesus. And I get to the end of it and I go, okay, and then I survey it. This was my life. The appropriate emotion that I will have if I'm honest with myself is, that's depressing. That's depressing. No matter how big it is. Even if it is the modern day equivalent to Solomon's temple, gold-plated. What he's saying is Nick, just enjoy right now. Just enjoy saying, that baby's so beautiful. Or, how was your week? Or, look what I found in Ecclesiastes. Or, the doing, that is itself the reward. And that pleasure can only come to the person who embraces the ordinary. But here's the problem with that. You can't embrace the ordinary. Because in the ordinary, if you want it to be the extraordinary, it has no lasting pleasure, it has no permanent accomplishment, and it has no ultimate meaning of significance or knowledge. And the thing is that you actually long for all of those things. And you desire them passionately, and you expect to find them in the ordinary life, and you're not finding them, and it's driving you crazy. And so what you want is to look for more somewhere else outside of the ordinary. And so Solomon is so clever about this. Twice in Ecclesiastes, he refers to that experience as the burden that God has laid on men. Okay, so what he's saying is this. He's saying God has actually put within the psychological framework, the internal thinking programming of your heart, an equation that can't balance. And it's just in there, and it doesn't work. And that's intentional. And it's in there designed for you to solve it with something from the outside, or it'll drive you insane. And that's intentional. Right? He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on men. Here's the burden. Here's the equation. Okay? It's not toil. It's not pain. It's not that you have a bad back. The most painful burden, the most absolute weight God has ever laid on he's laid on every human being is this burden. He has made everything beautiful in its time and has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. That's the burden. So every human being enters into the world and they see beauty. And they want it to last, but it doesn't last. They see that everything's beautiful in its time, and they think, I don't want change in this. I want this to stay the same, but I want there to be change. And yet in their heart, they want the forever. So you could imagine a butterfly not being angry about the fact that he doesn't live more than a week. Because he doesn't have eternity in his heart. So you can see him coming out of his chrysalis and flying around. These are really nice flowers. And knowing he's going to live one day and not be mad about it. He's like, yeah, but that sounds great. And sucks some nectar and lays some eggs and dies. You see, the problem is that we see a beauty. We see that the beauty is fading, and we have eternity in our hearts. We want there to be eternity. We want to understand eternity, and therefore we want to know what God has done from beginning to end, and we can't. Much of that is veiled from us, and so we see the beauty that doesn't last. We see that it's beautiful, and we know it doesn't last, and it's driving us crazy. That's why we can't handle our aging, right? Worldly people struggle incredibly with the fact that they're aging, right? Young people struggle really terribly with the fact that whatever potential they think that they have, at some point has to get converted into actual, or the potential eventually goes away, and that creates a ton of stress for them. I could do any job, but I have to pick one. I could do any education, but I have to pick one. That's one of the reasons why that and choosing a mate are some of the most stressful moments, is because everything about the future and how that future will age and change are bound up in those decisions. The absolute infinite is narrowed down to a single point of experience and being. The ordinary, the rhythm you'll enter into for your life, and it's terrifying. Because we haven't yet solved the equation that God put in our hearts so that we had to face the fact that he's there. You see what he says? He says that for the beginning, and I know that there's nothing better than for a man to be happy to do good while they live. That everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in his toil. That this is the gift of God. And I know that everything God does will endure forever. And nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. God does it so that men will revere him. You see what he's saying? He's saying, look, I know that creatures should act like creatures. I know that, like, just as a man, what I'm supposed to do with my life is to eat, drink, and toil and work and embrace the rhythms of my ordinary life and realize that I'm not God. And realize that there's not one thing that I will do that will last that is not bound up in something God does. God is God. He is the creator and not a creature. Everything that God will ever do will always last and will last forever. Anything that I do that is bound up in something he's doing will last forever. My redemption, the work of redemption in others, etc. That'll last forever. And that's it. And I won't even know what that is entirely in this life. And so that idea that I can let God be God and realize that I can trust him for all of those things and not know those things, such that I can just be a creature and live in the rhythms of my ordinary life and embrace them fully and completely with joy. He's like, I get that. And I get that God has made it that way so that we would revere him. And there's a lot of Christians that say, Nick, I believe that, but I still feel that stuff you're talking about. No, see, you still want access to the knowledge that's hidden and obscured in the God who is the eternal one. See, what Solomon is saying is there's a lot of stuff you want to know you just can't know. You want to actually know the philosophy or the thinking or the truths of the grounding of your eternalness. And actually, those are just in the person of God, but he doesn't tell you all of them, so therefore your trust can't be in the eternal truth that you can possess as wisdom of knowledge. It just has to be in God. That's it. And he said, now when you do that, God then turns around and gives happiness, wisdom, and knowledge. But not really the wisdom and knowledge you were after. The wisdom and knowledge that so fulfills and fortifies and creates substance in you embracing your ordinary life as a creature, which is a different wisdom and knowledge. But when you embrace your life as a creature, it'll be exactly what you want then. But it was nothing that you wanted before. You see how that change is the most fundamental one? That change from believing that you can find your grounding of everything and you realizing that you were never meant to be that kind of creature. So that you can embrace the very thing that you think is small and repetitive, that's bound up in roles and responsibilities and repetitions right in front of you, that is real life. And that denying that is actually producing your misery, not giving you an opportunity for happiness. And I fear that a whole generation of people, the younger the worse, just because of how the culture has moved and what we have memory of, is actually being led into a life of self-destructive and soul-narrowing misery because they can't see that. And so they keep fluttering off to things, trying to survey all that's in creation, find their ultimate grounding and meaning in something that can't ever do that. And God will not raise off of you the burden he has laid on men. That burden is meant to make you revere him, because it's the only way you can be eternally happy, and it's the only way that you can be a creature. Even. It's the only way you can even be yourself. So long as you're trying to be God and do his role, you could never be yourself. There is no yourself. There's only a fake you that's trying to steal God's role. And you can't love either. Love is all about the repetitions bounded in your roles and responsibilities to the people and duties right in front of you. Right? And you'll be cooking dinner, and your kid will be talking to you, and you'll be thinking about going on vacation or doing something else, you know? And so if you see that, then as you work through the book of Ecclesiastes, he's like, then God can give you all these things back. You can receive back from him the wholesomeness of life, the savor, the enjoyment of very plain and normal things. You'll like bread again. You'll breathe in the first breath of morning and you'll enjoy it. That first cold drink, that first gulp of orange juice that was in the fridge where you can feel the coldness going down your throat, there'll be a savor in it. There's a certain kind of life in life that goes away with cynicism and weariness and brokenness that comes from denying God's place. Right? You'll be able to receive back the nature of your life. Your life is going to be toil. You're going to work really hard. But when you embrace that as something worth doing, it becomes enjoyable too. Right? You get back meaning God doesn't give you the wisdom and knowledge just that he knows about all things, period, or even what you demand, but he will give you the knowledge and meaning of your life and the place you're in right now and what you need to relate to him, and therefore all things in eternity well, which is the knowledge and wisdom you need, and that will fulfill you. If you believe that's your role, then the perfect knowledge to fulfill that role, you'll be like, that's exactly what I need. You'll also be able to receive the rhythms, right? Because it says, if you read Ecclesiastes, you get to chapter 3, and you get this like, there's a time to do this and a time to do that, a time to do this, and a time to gather stones, a time to gather stones, time for war, a time for peace, a time for living, a time for dying, a time, right? And it's almost kind of weird, because it's kind of a poem, and the rest of the book flows like narrative, right? Like teaching, and you're kind of like, why is there a poem in the middle of this book? Until you realize that the rhythms of life are the most fundamental way to live out the ordinary. And the book is about receiving the ordinary, right? And one of the biggest things we suffer from as modern Americans is that our lives don't have the proper rhythms. We are not existing in this beautiful orbit of change and stasis. We're flittering all around, grabbing for change, leaving behind, like trying to keep the wrong things. Like instead of trying to keep my role the same, I want to keep my age the same, right? I want to keep the wrong things the same and the wrong things different, right? I want to be able to keep my sins and keep myself from aging, right? And my character is what needs to change, and my age is gonna. But who I am in Christ, the job I have, the roles of my ordinary life that I might want to change, those are the things that are supposed to stay the same. And then lastly, you can receive its comforts. Everything that God does endures forever. So in your ordinary life, God is sovereign over all of it. And anything that God does in your life and through your life will last forever. And you don't know what that is. You just don't know. You can't know, but what you can know is this. It's that anything that God does do through your life will last forever. And maybe someday you'll know what that is. And maybe right now you won't. And a lot of things you might think God is doing, he's not. And some things that you might not think God is doing, he is. And you probably have a very poor notion of what God is or isn't doing in your life. And that's why it is best for you to just know that everything that God does lasts forever. And if you give yourself to him, a lot of things in your life he'll be doing. And they'll last forever. And that's honestly, for the emotional and personal encouragement and grounding you need, that's enough. If you believe that, that's enough. Which means he uses that to forge our substance, right? Not just to work us over if we're idolaters, but he also uses that to bring us to himself and to teach us what we're meant to be in him. Now, here's one of the problems that we face. The minute we try to do this, so like you might be hearing me talk right now. You might not even be a Christian, and you might be like, you know what, I'm not even a Christian, but like, I know what you're saying is like kind of right. Like I realize that like if I give myself to like right now, like you're like, I mean, I can see a lot of the like this mindfulness psychology I've been reading in this, right? Yeah, well it is. Mindfulness psychology is the really shallow worldliness version of this that they stole from Christianity. Yes. Okay, and Buddhism has developed really well atheistically, right? And here's why you can do that. Because it's a fundamental human reality. However, here's the thing. Mindfulness will not solve the internal equation problem of the burden God has laid on men. You still have eternity in your heart, and you can't get rid of it, right? Mindfulness is bound up with transcendentalism, which is bound up with the assumption that you can accept that you're nothing. That your consciousness has come into existence and you'll go out of existence. That is, it's asking you to accept that you're the butterfly. And you see what Solomon says is that could never actually really happen. When you try to accept that for yourself, you're actually trying to destroy a true human longing, which is eternity in your heart. And that's why that system can never fully work. And so what has to happen is you have to believe, and then what you need to do is, remember, human beings become like what they imitate. You have to begin to put beliefs and practices into your life that will begin to form you back into understanding that your life is about embracing the ordinary, being in the beautiful revolution of change and stasis as a creature in the world, accepting the roles and the responsibilities and the repetitions and the rhythms of wholesome life in Christ. That make sense? So One of the first things that you've got to understand, because otherwise this will lie to you, is that the ordinary doesn't mean typical. Ordinary doesn't mean typical. You can't have an army with 1,000 generals and 1 soldier. You understand? There's a bottleneck to extraordinary of position. Only a few people can be extraordinary, right? If everybody was a star, the whole sky would be white and you couldn't see any stars and you wouldn't think they were fabulous, okay? There can only be certain number of pop stars, right? But everybody has access to being an extraordinary person of quality. So if we don't have to have a best mom, right? Everybody who's a mom who's here can try to be an extraordinary mother. Perfectly ordinary, not higher than anybody else in position, but extraordinary of quality. You understand? Same thing with dads, same thing with people who have jobs, same thing with everything we do. And when you see that, what you'll see is that therefore, if the extraordinary we're going for is quality, it is cooperative and not competitive. You understand? This mom doesn't have to compete with that mom. They can help each other be great moms because they're not actually in direct competition because they're not fighting for a bottlenecked position. And when you begin to think that way, even if you're in a business and somebody's going to get promoted, you'll actually get to the point of godliness where you want the best person to get the job. And if it's you, great. And if it's them, great. You have to find rhythms with limits. Okay, one of the problems with being rich, which everybody here is, even if you're on welfare, okay? Everybody's rich. This is, we're dealing with first world problems. It's one of the reasons why worldliness is our main focus. Is this: you can't get more time, but you can try to stuff more things into your time with your money, and it's destroying your life. Okay? There was a guy who owned the NBA team, the Clippers, a few years back, who had $1 million, right? And he said something racist to his girlfriend, and he had there was this big kerfuffle about that. And there was a lot of it was about this rich guy, right? And somebody was like, he's not that rich. Wrote an article, was like, he's not that rich. People were like, what? And I was reading that, I was like, what? He's pretty rich, right? He's like, listen, imagine you're 22. You're 22 years old. Would you trade all the years between 22 and his 82 for his money? Think about your answer. And the answer is no. Almost nobody. What do you do with $150 million when you're 82? You can't buy your way back to 22. In that sense, in a meaningful sense, if you said no in your heart, you are more wealthy if you're 22 than that 82-year-old, because time is truly priceless. But what you can do with money is you can try to stuff more things into your time, right? You can get an assistant, right? And that gets you more time, but it doesn't really get you more time. The assistant actually can get you involved in more things, so you still have to do more even though you've got an assistant, right? You've got more money so you can get your kids in more stuff, but you still got to get your kids to all that stuff, and they don't have any more time. So what you get is a kid that goes with a lot of stuff but's really anxious. But you can, listen, with money, you can get more time because you can just buy them an antidepressant. And then they can keep doing all that stuff, and the time they don't have to be psychologically normal, we can take care of with a pharmaceutical, right? And we can just take our money and take our stuff, and we can just try to cram it into our time. And here's the reality. You cannot beat that equation. You can only do a few things that you give yourself to undistractedly. Everything else is a distraction. Do you understand? And we have to get that right in our rhythms of coming to church and worshiping with each other and prayer and devotion. Friendship, parenting, all that stuff has rhythms to it, right? And we have to find those rhythms, and those rhythms can really only come from most Americans when we institute new limits. A third thing is we need to get rid of vampire practices. One of the things that we do when we're feeling as depressed as worldliness makes us is we try to suck life out of other lives, and the lives that we usually suck it out of are false lives. So social media lives are fake lives, right? They're cherry-picked bits of lives that make it look like a life, but they're fake lives, right? So are TV shows and movies. Human beings do not behave like that. Bullets do not fly with those kinds of ballistics. People don't survive those injuries. None of it's true. I can't think of maybe one or two romances in all of modern movies and TV is anything but utterly preposterous. between human beings. Like they're completely fake lives, right? Pornography and like women romance smut novels, completely fake humanity. Gossip and online arguments. Like, I don't know if you know this, I was reading a policy wonk talk by George H.W. Bush this week where he was talking, this is of course in agreement with President Obama as well, that it is like a standard deal that large amounts of money are being spent in Russia right now to actually go into websites in America and leave really hateful, divisive comments everywhere. If you have responded to a hateful comment on an American website, a website in English, that is like really idiotic, that you're like, who is this hick, or who is this like liberal idiot, or who is this, and you're like, I'm going to save the world. Like, it's pretty decently likely you were responding to a Russian bot, like a computer just throwing these things out there just to make us all hate each other. Here's why. Because we allow ourselves to believe fake lives. The comments on Facebook are not real lives. It's one of the reasons why you can't even have a relationship over text messages. Almost everything in human communication is not the text. And emojis don't really help because they can be snide. I think you're an idiot, smiley face. And so what we do is there's all this fake humanity we've created, and then we've made our lives horrible by not accepting we're creatures in rhythms, and then we go and we try to sink our hollowed teeth into this mass of Kool-Aid to like suck ourselves alive and to feel something, and it's all fake. And you gotta see it to flee it. Get Facebook off your phone. Just delete it. Delete your whole account. Stop going on the internet. Like, you can do these things. Like, I've had guys who I've talked about getting rid of pornography. I'm like, listen, if I counsel you and we get to you take every device you have and throw it in the lake, are you willing to do that? And if they say no, I won't counsel them. Because you got to know what you want. What are you after? If you want, listen, you may have to destroy everything with a screen in your house to save your marriage. Do it. Who cares? Who cares if you miss an episode of... Do you realize how weird that addiction is? And yet we all sit in front of these glowing things all of our lives. And the average person touches their phone like 2,400 times a day. Just every time you take your phone out of your pocket, ask yourself this question. Why am I taking my phone out of my pocket? And see how that makes you feel. Okay. The section in the book on this I hope you'll read is that producing and serving has to overcome our consuming and receiving, right? The Apostle Paul said when he spoke to the Ephesian elders, I worked. I never let myself be a burden on you financially not because, in this case with the Ephesians, it wasn't because he didn't want them to become cynical. That was a different church. With him, he says, I did it, in Acts 20, because I wanted you to see that this is how a Christian lives. A Christian works and produces. A Christian does things. A Christian contributes to the lives of others and takes joy in contributing to the lives of others. And the reason why a Christian does that is that because that's what every healthy, happy, wholesome human does. I talked to the woman this week who has had a stroke, has a hard time brushing her own teeth, and she's had excruciating pain in one side of her head. And she said, I've been praying for you a lot this week, Pastor Nick. You and each one of your children. You see, this is a woman who has to lay in bed about 6 hours a day, and she's working. She's giving. She's serving as best she can. Understand? And because she knows that's where meaning lies, right? Ben Sass did this huge, AEI guy, Arthur Brooks, did this big study, and he found that there were 4 basic fundamentals of human happiness. None of them had to do with receiving or poverty. Not one. Whether or not you had enough food to eat wasn't one of them. But whether or not you did some kind of work that you believe contributed to the lives of others was. Sometimes that is you need to start working. Sometimes it is just you need to look at your job completely differently. Okay, because I remember when I was a host in a restaurant in Chicago, and I would hand out stained menus, and sometimes I would work the door on Saturday nights where people would come and just scream at me, like executives, like Chicago executives. I'm gonna get you fired, and you're an SOB, effing, you name it, it was said to me. And There were only about 3 of the 20 hosts that could work the door on Saturday because we were the ones who wouldn't lose our cool. But what you had to see was there was a huge value in being sworn at. You know what I mean? Because that guy might have seen the earnings of his company for this quarter and realized his job was going to be on the line and was trying to have a dinner with his wife. And in a very sinful way, he was blowing off a whole bunch of his steam on me, and maybe he wasn't going to scream at her later. And so for me to be like, sir, I totally get that. You may want to talk to the manager about firing me because I'm pretty much an idiot. But you also might want to go in and take your number and get a couple of Mai Tais, and you might feel a lot better, right? And he'd cuss at me again, and then he'd go in, and then he'd have a couple of Mai Tais, and he'd feel a lot better, and his wife would have a nice dinner. And that's worthwhile work. I felt like it was worthwhile work. I was showing him virtue in whatever way I could. I was trying to demonstrate how one should behave. I was willing to receive some of his anger, hopefully in a propitiatory way so that it wouldn't go on somebody else in his life, maybe one of his workers, maybe one of his kids. I felt like that could be a service to him, and I tried to grow in that attitude about it, and it developed and changed me. It helped me support my family. It allowed everybody in the restaurant to have a good time because there weren't screaming people everywhere. It allowed him to have a better time. It allowed for a lot of goods. You understand? But because I wasn't thinking about what I was getting or receiving from this. Well, I'm making $12 an hour, and this isn't worth this. This ain't worth this. No, it wasn't about what I was receiving. It was about what I was doing. God gave me life and strength to serve, and that was the job I was doing right then. And I didn't particularly like that job. In the broader sense of what I thought I was capable of, that's why I was trying to develop my other capabilities so I could then get a different job. But that didn't change how I embraced that one while I was doing it. Do you understand? We talked about having an attitude of thankfulness. Whether or not you have an attitude of thankfulness is one of the most fundamental realities internally about whether or not you can be happy, right? And if you know you've been redeemed and you're being changed and you're going through the practices of worship and prayer, ultimately it comes down to you can also be fascinated by creation, which there's a section on the book that I think is really helpful. But ultimately, flippancy and snobbery is soul, joy, and hope killing. And for most of us, that's what we're around. We're around a lot of sarcasm, flippancy, and snobbery. And because that's what we're around, and because it's dangerous to be a deeply sincere person, most of us are too cowardly to be a deeply sincere person, right? And so we tend to fall into the snide remarks and the sarcasm, whatever, really just so we don't get attacked. But remember, we become whatever we imitate. And over time, that becomes who we are, and over time it crushes the hope and the joy and the sincerity and the truthfulness. But instead, if we can be people that are fascinated by everything, we will find everything fascinating. And people will find us fascinating, and we can bring joy to them too. And so whether or not you're able to, in Christ, grow in a fascination towards everything around you, in the rhythms of change, will be deeply fundamental to whether or not you can enter into the kind of rhythms that can make you the kind of person that can gladly embrace the ordinary. And if you revel as a fascinated creature in the ordinary, you can hardly help but be a creature of joy and hope and life and love and liberty and truthfulness. To be somebody who resembles the God who saved them. This is one of the most functional ways we seek God, his character, his kingdom, and his righteousness, so that he can add the rest of the stuff to us as well. Start with this, and then you'll like your job. Don't start with how much you hate your job. Start with being a creature under the Creator. Embrace the ordinary. Do this first, and you will find it will change everything. Let's pray. Father, thank you that we can be a people that can just be people. It's such a weird thing to be a creature that has eternity in its heart. I don't know if there's any other creatures that are like that. We hardly even know what that means to be bounded in a creation that's changing and wanting what's beautiful never to change and yet enjoying it. But thank you for the burden you've laid on all of humanity. Thank you that you did it so that we would revere you. And teach us what it means to trust you and to believe you in such a way as to know that everything that you do lasts forever. And nothing that we do lasts forever. And because we can accept that gladly, that we can eat and drink and find satisfaction in all our toil and love you all our days. Make us the kind of people who in that ordinary love each other and grow in spiritual substance and find the joy and the hope that we're meant to find in it. Holy Spirit, please move in us now in Jesus' name. Amen.